Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the horrific murder of Tim McLean. This happened in Canada by a man named Vince Lee. This case involves severe mental illness, and it also questions the Canadian justice system and how we look at rehabilitation. It's been very controversial, and not a lot of Canadians agree with how this case unfolded. Let's get into it. Tim McLean Jr. was born October 3rd, 1985. He grew up outside of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, in a small town called Ely. Tim was a very active person, not shy at all, and loved people. He had a great relationship with his father and brother and was from a huge family which he loved and valued very much. His friends would say that he was always really happy and pleasant to be around. He absolutely loved life and lived life to the fullest. Tim loved to travel and meet new people, so much so that he got a job as a carnival worker. This would give him the freedom to explore Canada and be around all types of people. He was also really good at his job because he was so outgoing and super talkative. He typically would run the Midway Games, attracting people with his outgoing and fun-loving personality. He also got along with his coworkers, and when the night was over, they all hung out, and he was always a part of the group. Through his travels with the carnival, he would fall in love with British Columbia. He decided that he wanted to plant his roots somewhere in BC, but quite possibly Vancouver Island. So by the end of July of 2008, Tim would decide that he didn't want to go to the next stop with the traveling carnival. Instead, he would be going back to BC to work at the PNE, which stands for the Pacific National Exhibition. The PNE is an annual event, and it's pretty big. It includes a carnival section with Midway Games, lots of rides, trade shows, dog shows, all sorts of stuff. It's something everyone looks forward to before school resumes in September. Before going to the PNE, Tim wanted to return home first to relax and visit family because after the PNE was over, he'd probably be off on a new adventure. When people learned he was returning home, his friends offered to buy him a plane ticket, but Tim declined, and instead he would take the Greyhound from Edmonton to Winnipeg. He didn't mind the Greyhound. There was lots of scenery to look at, and he could relax. He would take bus 1170 around midnight from Edmonton to start his journey home. And during his travel homes, he would meet Vince Lee. Vince Lee was born April 30th, 1968 in Dandong City, China. His father would say he was born 1 month premature, but due to healthcare in China, he wasn't incubated and just sent home. This resulted in Vince being sickly as a baby and in his teens. He was often 1 to 2 years behind many developmental milestones, but despite his struggles, he did well in school and graduated with a Bachelor of Science in 1992. He briefly worked in a factory in Beijing and would meet his wife there, marrying her in 1995. When they were living in China, their life was simple, and Vince seemed normal and happy. Friends or family didn't notice that Lee was struggling with any type of mental illness. He wasn't violent, didn't do drugs, or drink excessively. Vince and his wife would emigrate to Winnipeg, Canada from China in 2001. With a lot of immigrants, Vince struggled to find employment. Even though Vince had a college degree, he would end up working in the kitchen at McDonald's for a little while. Vince's wife would also work in a restaurant, and because Vince wasn't happy with working at McDonald's, he would go to CDI College and take some computer courses that paired well with the degree he already had. Unfortunately, he still couldn't get good employment, and he would work at Tim Hortons in the kitchen there as well. Around 2004, Vince and his wife would start to argue a lot, and this was because something was wrong. Vince was starting to hear voices and believed that the son told him that he was a Chinese Jesus. Vince would tell his wife that he actually saw God. And his wife thought that he was just tired, so she bought him sleeping pills, thinking that a good night's sleep would do the trick. Vince would go on to say that his voices were getting more frequent and giving him directions and guidance, which was alarming to people that knew him. Some of their friends and his wife asked that he go see a doctor, but Vince refused as he didn't really trust Western medicine. The constant bickering and stress caused Vince and his wife to separate in 2005. And it was also around this time that Vince would go to Toronto thinking he'd find employment there, but he had failed, and God told him to go back to Winnipeg. Vince would throw away his luggage and started walking down the highway. Police would pick him up, and Vince seemed very disoriented. He was acting like he hadn't really eaten or slept in days, and he would be taken to a psychiatric facility. The doctors would diagnose Vince with having a schizophrenia catatonic state, and they kept him for about 10 days and gave him medicine to try and help him. There are no discharge papers for him, so it's most likely that he left on his own, but he would later say that the hospital stay is kind of hazy, and at the time he thought he was being punished for something and didn't bring his medication with him when he left. When he got home, he would file for divorce and would go back to China for a little while. And his father would remember that Vince seemed irritable and also wasn't able to hold down a job there either. Vince would move back to Canada and would reunite with his ex-wife. They'd settle in Edmonton, where he would get a job at Walmart, as well as delivering newspapers. Then in 2007, he would get his Canadian citizenship. And while it sort of sounds like Vince was coping, he wasn't. He was still continuing to hear voices all the time. By 2008, it said that people noticed Vince's behavior and he was becoming very erratic. His moods would be off, or he wouldn't be able to have a normal conversation with people. He'd often blurt things out that were out of context to what they were discussing. Vince would get fired from his Walmart job after getting into an argument with a coworker, and he would leave his wife again, not telling her where he was going or why. Right before making this decision to leave, he would say that he was having strange thoughts of aliens and that he was chosen by God to rid the world of these aliens. After being let go from Walmart, he began traveling around to try and find the aliens because he knew he had to kill them. God then told him that his life was in danger, so he had to buy a hunting knife at Canadian Tire to use for protection. Vince's plan was to go to Manitoba and then on to Thunder Bay, Ontario. But when the bus stopped in Erickson, Manitoba, God told Vince to stay there. So Vince would sit on a bench waiting to hear from God for the next plan. A witness who worked at a gas station across the street from the bench would say that he just sat there staring off into the distance, wearing sunglasses for hours. Vince would end up staying there overnight and then put a for sale sign note on his laptop for $600. The same witness from the gas station would go on and offer him $60 for the laptop, and Vince said okay and included his laptop bag for free. Around 6 p.m. on July 30th, 2008, Vince Lee would board Greyhound bus 1170 from Erickson, Manitoba, the same bus that Tim was already on. Passengers would remember that Vince, a 6-foot-tall, middle-aged man wearing sunglasses, seemed a bit agitated or even confused. He would pick a seat near the front of the bus and, like most people, wouldn't speak to anyone and just kept to himself. Other passengers on the bus said nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for one passenger who said he had a bad feeling about Vince right from the start. He couldn't quite pinpoint why, but he just knew something was wrong. The bus would take a few rest stops for people to stretch their legs, and while they were in Portage-la Prairie, Manitoba, Vince would leave the bus during that break and have a cigarette outside by himself. When it was time to continue on, the witness who had a bad feeling said that Vince seemed even more agitated and would walk down the aisle looking at each and every person. Instead of sitting back down in his original seat like most people do, Vince would go to the back of the bus and sit next to Tim McLean. Remembering back when I took the Greyhound, this behavior is odd and sort of frowned upon. You only sit next to someone if there are no other seats, and typically you would sit back in the same seat you were sitting in before a rest stop. Tim, however, being the laid-back person that he is, didn't seem bothered by it. Tim had been polite to Vince and asked him how he was doing. Tim would then close his eyes, rest his head against the window, listening to his music to fall asleep. Vince apparently would continue to act strangely. He had with him a 2-liter bottle of iced tea and a roll of toilet paper that he would tuck under his chin when he drank from his iced tea bottle. A passenger named Steve, who was beside Vince on the other side of the aisle, said that he would start rocking to himself and chant something that sounded like Chinese. Steve remembers that it made him really nervous, but he just sat quietly with his wife because he didn't want to bring attention towards himself in fear of him or his wife getting hurt. Only about 5 minutes later, around 8:35 p.m., God told Vince to kill Tim and eliminate the force of evil. Steve would watch in horror as Vince took a large hunting knife out of his backpack and turned towards Tim. Tim would wake up as Lee impaled him in his neck. Vince would later say that when he was stabbing Tim, he was simply doing everyone a service by taking action and listening to these voices. Steve would start yelling, "Stop the bus," and witnesses would describe the screams of Tim as being haunting and something that they'll never forget. Ones that were close enough to see what was happening described Vince as emotionless. There was no rage, no anger, just robotic stabbing. Steve would say that it felt like the stabbing didn't stop. He would do his best to assist his wife and other passengers off the bus. When the bus did pull over, everyone would scramble off the bus away from Vince. And Vince didn't seem to notice the chaos of the passengers leaving, as he was just in his own little world stabbing Tim. Chris Aguirre, a truck driver, saw the Greyhound pulled over with all the passengers on the side of the highway. He stopped to see if they needed help, and a woman screamed that someone was being stabbed, so he would radio for help. Chris and another man armed with a metal bar from his truck tried to go back into the bus to see if they could help Tim and stop Vince from whatever he was doing. Chris would also describe Vince as emotionless. Vince wouldn't say a word to them. Instead, he would robotically lean over Tim's body and began beheading him with his knife. When Chris and the man yelled for Vince to stop, Vince would chase them out with his knife in one hand and, according to Chris, Tim's head in the other. The men would jump off the bus and barricade the door, and Vince would walk right up to the door, hold up Tim's head to show the passengers what he had done. Vince would then walk up and down, holding Tim's head, further terrifying the passengers. Vince would go back to Tim's body and continue to mutilate it. This was all done by the word of God. Vince was trying to stop an evil force and thought that this was what he had to do. When RCMP arrived, they really had no idea what they were going to encounter. A group of men were guarding the door with crowbars and hammers, really any equipment they could find to use as weapons. Vince was still pacing the length of the bus armed with his knife. RCMP would call in special negotiators because there was no way to get Vince off the bus, and he was just not communicating with anyone. He would occasionally stop pacing the bus, but would continue cutting up and cannibalizing Tim's body. It took over 5 hours to try and convince Vince to get off the bus. Passengers didn't really understand why the police allowed this to go on for so long. Police didn't try and shoot him, they didn't try and gas the bus, but decided to just wait it out and try and reason with Vince. But Vince wasn't being reasonable. Instead, he was doing unthinkable things to Tim's body. This would be very difficult for people to understand, even to this day. Finally, after 5 hours, Vince would eventually try and escape out of the window near the back of the bus and would be tasered and taken away in handcuffs. Vince would later calmly say, "I'm guilty, please kill me." When they searched Vince, they would find Tim's nose and parts of his tongue in his pocket. Tim's eyes and part of his heart were never recovered. Now, officers had to not only deal with Vince, but they needed to go into the bus and examine the scene, which was basically pieces of Tim scattered around the bus. Dr. Stanley Yaron met with Vince, and Vince wasn't really able to speak much because at that point he was heavily medicated. Dr. Yaron gave Vince a pad of paper and a pencil, and Vince would write, "God will kill me." So to Dr. Yaron, it was clear that Vince Lee was deep into the thick of his mental illness. Every single person who knew Tim were horrified and deeply saddened by what happened. His community and family were in shock. The violence was so unspeakable. Vince would officially be charged with second-degree murder, but when it was time for Vince to appear in court, he decided not to hire a lawyer. He did have representation who said that Vince couldn't be held accountable for what he did because he had untreated schizophrenia. During the trial, people would learn that Vince actually tried to kill a man the day before he killed Tim. Vince was at the bus station and saw a man driving around, and God told Vince that this man had come to kill him. So Vince pulled out his knife, but thankfully that truck drove away. Vince would also say that he was supposed to stay in Erickson to live forever by the word of God. But Vince had disobeyed God's orders when he boarded the bus that day. So God was angry and told him that Tim was going to kill him. So this was partly self-defense to him and partly removing evil from the world. Vince truly believed that God wanted him to kill Tim, and mutilating his body would prevent him from resurrecting from the dead. Now, this wasn't the almighty God he was referring to. He was hearing all sorts of gods, good gods and evil gods, and these voices were just tearing him apart. It got to the point that he believed he needed to kill or be killed. During the trial, Vince was given psychiatric evaluations, and all the evidence does point to mental illness as well, so the judge agreed that he was not criminally responsible. So instead of going to prison, Vince was committed to a high-security psychiatric ward for a year to be evaluated and treated for his schizophrenia. Tim's family, and I would say a lot of Canada, were not happy with this outcome. In Canada, we have NCR, not criminally responsible, which is probably comparable to not guilty by reason of insanity in America. I believe America also has guilty but mentally ill, which may have been more appropriate in this situation. The anguish Tim's family went through didn't seem to equate what Vince's consequences were. Vince still brutally murdered someone, and his family wants the laws changed so others don't go through what they went through. After that first year, Vince would be transferred to a psychiatric center in Selkirk, Manitoba until 2017. Chris Somerville, chief executive of the Schizophrenic Society of Canada, says that Vince lives every day with remorse for what he did, and he knows what he did was atrocious. Apparently, he's embarrassed and very ashamed. Vince would also say he's happy to be on medication, it's working, and he doesn't hear voices anymore. He admits he would be happy to be under a treatment order and never wants to do what he did ever again, and promises he would call his doctors if it ever happened again. So while Vince seems to be doing so much better, sadly, witnesses to this event are still suffering from PTSD. Many now have anxiety issues, they can't go into large crowds or take buses ever again. The RCMP officer who first boarded the bus never recovered. The visions of that day wouldn't leave him, and 6 years later, he would take his own life. So while Vince got treatment and is doing okay, living his life, not everyone else is. Chris Agar, the truck driver who stopped to help, unfortunately saw a lot of what happened on the bus as well, because he was so close and standing there barricading the door. He suffers from PTSD, and there isn't a day that goes by that he doesn't mourn Tim McLean. Sadly, Chris's PTSD pushed him into alcoholism. It started just to simply help him sleep at night, but the nightmares wouldn't stop, and his drinking would get worse and worse. Another passenger who gave birth years later had her newborn taken away by social workers because they were concerned her mental illness, which stems from PTSD on that day, would make her unfit to care for her own child. Her child stayed in a foster care for 18 months before custody was given to the child's grandmother. This passenger has nightmares, trouble sleeping, can't use public transit, and has problems trusting people. She's on medication, and it's not known if she'll ever recover. Our Canadian justice system is very much about rehabilitation, which isn't a bad thing. We can't just throw people in jail who have mental illness. But the question of accountability in the case of Vince Lee will always be an issue. Vince was apparently a model patient. He was cooperative in the mental health center, and by 2010, he would be given outside privileges and would have visitors. Health professionals would say he understands his mistakes and just wants to live a responsible life. The following year, in 2011, his doctors would give him more freedoms because they thought he was responding so well to treatment. In 2012, he was allowed temporary passes that meant he could go into the town of Selkirk, Manitoba, but he was supervised by a nurse and a peace officer. He responded well to these outings, and in 2014, Vince would be allowed to go unsupervised into town, starting with just 30 minutes, but it would increase to full day trips. Vince would also change his name to Will Baker in 2016 before being fully released in 2017 with an absolute discharge. The courts have said he does not pose a significant threat to the safety of the public. Reading older newspaper articles on this case, the family of Tim McLean and the following passengers really didn't think Vince would get an absolute discharge. Their lawyer was also sure this would never happen and knew it would cause tremendous psychological harm to Tim's family. Carol, Tim's mother, would say that the trauma Tim's family has and the other passengers wasn't taken into consideration, and she was sick to her stomach when she found out about his freedom. From what I could find, Will Baker has kept out of trouble since being freed and apparently lives on his own. Back in 2017, it was said that he was going to try and get post-secondary training and wanted to get a career and stay in Manitoba. Doctors were confident that Will would remain on his medication and that he understands that he has to continue his medication to live a reasonable and responsible life. My thoughts? My first knee-jerk reaction is to think that Vince Lee needs to be locked up because it was traumatizing to hear what his actions were that day. Realistically, though, we do need to give treatment to those who are mentally ill versus putting them in jail. Not treating mental illness is just wrong. I'm not a doctor, obviously, and I feel like schizophrenia is a very misunderstood disease. But it has been proven that people with schizophrenia really aren't in their right mind at all when going through these episodes. They truly don't know what's going on around them and are completely out of touch with reality. They also just can't snap out of it. So part of me does think that he shouldn't be held accountable the same way a neurotypical person would be. However, I battle with that because of all the trauma Tim's family and these passengers have gone through. It just doesn't seem fair. I read on mentalillnesspolicy.org that the biggest reason for people to stop treatment is because part of schizophrenia is the person's brain being unable to perceive that they are ill. There is a name for it called anosognosia syndrome. Basically, their brain is thinking that they don't need medication anymore because they're fine, whether they have symptoms or not. Not all schizophrenics experience this, but a huge percentage does, especially during a relapse or an episode. And Vince had refused treatment in 2005 and didn't realize he was ill, making excuses for all of these voices. So does he have or had anosognosia syndrome? Treatment for mental illness also isn't lateral, so he's still going to have good days and he's still going to have bad days. But having an absolute discharge means that we just have to hope that he goes to the doctor if he relapses. As far as the justice in this case, if anything, at the very minimum, I feel like Vince should have at least been put on some sort of conditional release for the rest of his life. Not necessarily a criminal record or jail, but just to have to check in with a mental health team regularly to make sure he continues to take his medication and continues his treatment. And I say this partly because we don't know if he'll ever become violent again, and partly because as a society, we need to make sure people with mental illness are looked after. I'm curious to know what you think about this case, especially if you're from another country, or if you're from Canada too. What do you think about the NCR laws and Vince being totally free? That's it for today. Thanks again for joining me here at Felony Spectator, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you next week.